Kizamde, I'm on the beat!
Hello everyone, today I'm back to take another look at your JoJo hot takes. When I first asked my community to provide their hot takes for me to respond to, I got a huge response, and the video itself ended up being a big hit. I received so many responses that a second video was a no-brainer since I have a ton of topics to choose from here. Like with the first video, this will contain spoilers for every part of JoJo, but the topics will be ordered by part so you'll know when you have to stop watching to avoid getting spoiled. Our first topic deals with part 1. They say Speedwagon is an extremely overrated character since all he does is sit back and watch while everything is going on. Now of course I have to disagree since Speedwagon is one of my favorite JoJo characters. While he is certainly a character that remains mostly on the sidelines, I do think Speedwagon's emotional support can't be understated. Remember that Jonathan is a person who has felt rejected by everyone around him despite always trying to do good, and Speedwagon was one of the few people to recognize the strength of Jonathan's heart, and from that moment he became incredibly loyal to him. Jonathan's entire life was destroyed by Dio, and Speedwagon is one of the few people he had left. I really think the trio of Jonathan, Zeppeli, and Speedwagon is one of the most underrated protagonist groups in the series. I feel like Speedwagon's role also improved over time since I like the older Speedwagon even more. He serves as the main connecting thread between part 1 and 2, and the story even introduces him before any other characters. And part 2 really showed his devotion to the Joestar family, which I've always thought was very touching. So overall, I disagree with the hot take, and I can't bring myself to dislike Speedwagon at all. This next one says that the explanation behind the stone mask in part 2 was unnecessary and that it actually harmed the story by removing the supernatural aspect from vampirism. I also disagree with this take. The supernatural forces depicted in JoJo have always had an extra layer to them, often crossing boundaries between science fiction and fantasy. This is really part of JoJo's unique flavor, and I think its portrayal of vampires is part of what makes JoJo stand out. And the thing is, this idea existed already before part 2 showed the backstory of the mask. We already knew in part 1 that JoJo's vampires were not a traditional portrayal. This was directly shown with how Dio was immune to typical anti-vampire symbols like a crucifix. Zeppeli's explanation of Haman to Jonathan also pointed out the unique biological nature of these vampires, and how they became incompatible with the energy of the sun. So really, I just don't get this complaint at all. Next are some for part 3. First, this person says that the Unduel fight in the OVA adaptation was handled better than in the manga or the anime. I actually agree here. I think the 1993 OVA in some ways adapts the material better than the TV anime, and in certain cases is equal to or better than the original manga. Of course, I'll always say that the manga is better overall since it's Araki's art and it doesn't have anything cut out. As we know, the OVAs only adapt certain moments from part 3 and don't show the whole journey like the manga does. And I don't think the OVAs are perfect since some fights like the one with Vanilla Ice aren't as good as the manga, and the first half of the journey that was later adapted in 2000 is a step down in a lot of ways. I'd actually expand on this comment though, since I believe not just in Duel, but also Darby and parts of the Dio fight are handled better than the anime as well. Part 3's anime had some pacing issues, and one of the worst offenders was the Darby fight being stretched to 2 episodes, while in the OVA we have a pretty much flawless adaptation which fits in one. And while the Dio fight is missing some stuff like the road roller, I love the way Time Stop is portrayed in it, and the extra scenes added to the fight are great. This next hot take is that part 3's pace is good. While many people complain about part 3 saying it's too long or too episodic, this person says it was actually handled well and the conclusion was very satisfying. And I agree here for the most part. I said before that the part 3 anime has some pacing issues, but I'm referring just to the adaptation, which drags in some fights where the manga doesn't. I would call the manga's pacing spot on. As for part 3's length and it being episodic, I don't see these as negatives like many people do. Part 3 should be long, since it's a journey all across the world, and really the only way to properly portray such a thing is with it being episodic, since the Crusaders naturally have to make stops at the cities along the way. I get that the so-called Monster of the Week formula is tiring for some people, but I quite enjoy it, especially with the main cast of Part 3, which I adore. This format also let Araki really flesh out the ideas for stands, and I think it let the concept evolve more than it would have with fewer battles. And like the commenter says, having so many battles on such a long journey makes things like reaching Egypt and Dio's mansion feel like huge milestones, which I feel like is the intended effect to make it feel like an epic journey. For our last Part 3 take, this person says that Jotaro actually knew he could stop time from the beginning of Part 3. They claim that Jotaro stopped time during the fight with Darby, and the reason Darby was scared of him was because he recognized it as Dio's ability. Now, I don't even know if I would classify this as a take or just as a theory, but I kinda feel like I have to respond to it since it's just not true whatsoever. Jotaro did not stop time until the final fight with Dio, and this fact is made very clear in the story. I've actually seen a lot of people make this claim regarding the Darby fight, but this is definitely not time stop, it is simply Star Platinum's fast speed. Even Darby's inner monologue never mentions stopping time, he only wonders if Jotaro is fast enough to pull all this off. The more important thing disproving this idea, though, is that we know what it's like for someone to learn how to stop time. According to Enya, you must believe that you can stop time for it to happen. Dio slowly made this realization and eventually could see within stop time. Jotaro didn't start to see within time stop until he learned that was Dio's ability and tried it himself. And lastly, if Jotaro had been stopping time all along this journey, Dio, as someone who can also time stop, would have surely noticed that, but there's no indication of that happening whatsoever. Next we have a hot take for Part 4. They say that you could remove half of Part 4 and it would be the same story. Now, this is something I've heard people say for years, and not even just about Part 4. You see the same kind of thing applied to other parts that have non-essential fights as well. I've always found these kinds of opinions odd since, well, yeah, you could probably remove a lot of fights in JoJo without directly impacting the plot, I just have to ask, why would you do such a thing? I really just don't get the whole idea of wanting to watch anime or read manga in the most utilitarian way possible. And I feel like it's pretty self-evident that these story arcs serve a larger purpose than simply advancing the plot. Really, I can think of tons of arcs like the fight with Oingo and Boingo or the visit to Tonio's restaurant that, despite not being completely essential to the story, are both beloved segments of the manga that define that part's identity. Part of the whole point of Part 4 is building up the atmosphere of Morio as a setting, and simply gutting half the manga for no real reason would do nothing but harm the story. For our next hot take, this person says that Rohan is annoying and that there are plenty of other characters who deserve more stories than him. Now beyond this comment, I've actually seen this sentiment before with many people who seem to think Rohan shouldn't be the main subject of JoJo's spin-offs. These opinions range from just confusion as to why Rohan was chosen for this, to anger from some people that dislike the character. Now personally, I love the spin-off, and Rohan is one of my favorite JoJo characters. I also believe that out of all the characters in JoJo, Rohan is the single best one to use for the stories Araki wants to tell. As a mangaka, Rohan is a person constantly seeking out new material, and so I think he works wonderfully as a guide through different episodic adventures like we see in the spin-off. Rohan's abrasive personality has always been one of my favorite things about the character, and that's exactly the kind of character that works best here since it keeps him getting involved in conflict. And regardless of how you feel about Rohan, I think the spin-off has produced some of Araki's best one-off stories, and it's an opportunity to explore things that wouldn't normally appear in the main series. Now for Part 5, this person says Pink Suit Giorno is better than Blue Suit Giorno. In case you aren't aware, this is referring to the fact that before the anime, Giorno was typically presented wearing dark blue, like in the colored manga and video games. But starting with Part 5's anime adaptation in 2018, which chose to have him wear pink, he's had that as his default color ever since. Now, I don't care too much one way or the other, but some people made quite a big fuss about this when it first happened. One thing I think is important for people to remember is that David Production actually reached out to Araki to choose the color schemes of the main characters, and he ended up choosing the pink for Giorno himself. Really, I think any color works for Giorno, but I do think Araki made a good choice here. The pink is a really iconic color for him, with it being used in some of the best Giorno illustrations. For another Giorno-related hot take, this person says that while Part 5 is good, it has no effect on the JoJo bloodline, and the fact that Giorno is Dio's son is completely irrelevant to the plot. Now for starters, I just don't necessarily see all that as a bad thing. I actually like that Part 5 is relatively standalone compared to other parts, and it let the story focus on something new instead of feeling the need to make older characters a big part of the story. And while Giorno being the son of Dio is not directly a big factor in the story, I think it actually serves a huge purpose thematically, which this comment and others seem to ignore. As Koichi says, Giorno is shown to be someone that carries the Joestar will by fighting for justice, despite having had no contact with his extended family. The main theme that Araki wanted to get across with Part 5 was how people reckon with fate when they're born into poor circumstances. All the main characters fit into this, but instead of being slaves to fate, they choose to live for a greater purpose. This is why Giorno being the son of Dio is so relevant, since in many ways, they're the same. Dio was also born into a bad life, but instead of striving to live as a good person in spite of that, he turned to the path of evil and wished to push others below him. Even when he met the Joestars and found a new family, he still conspired to destroy them and take their place. Dio shunned his humanity as well as his own fate, wishing he had Jonathan's life instead. Dio's rejection of his fate is the very thing that leads to his downfall, and his parallels with Giorno are very clear, with Giorno persevering despite his past and using his ambition to do something good. Instead of destroying those around him, he uplifts them and helps them overcome their past as well. For our last Part 5 one, we have a take related to probably the most controversial moment in the part, the departure of Fugo from the story. This comment says that as unfortunate as it is, Fugo leaving was a good thing for the drama it caused in the group. And I agree here. As I've spoken about before, in Araki's original plan for the story, Fugo would have been some kind of spy for the boss, and would end up fighting the protagonists and possibly dying. Due to Araki's mental state at the time, he decided against doing this and had him leave the group instead. Now, I'm sure whatever he had planned would have been a good addition to the story, and it would probably alleviate the idea that Fugo was wasted as a character. But I actually like the portrayal of Fugo that we have, and like this comment says, I do think it strengthens the motivations of the main characters by showing one of them not willing to continue the journey. This next one is for Part 6. Here they say that the Dragon's Dream and Yo-Yo Ma arcs are overhated in terms of fights. And I agree with this. If you look up some of the most common criticisms of Part 6, they seem to come down to this segment of the story in particular, which people sort of lump together as the Punishment Ward arc. And really, after years of being in this discourse, I still don't quite get what people's issue with it is, other than just stating that it's bad. But I assume it comes down to some confusion over the number of stand users operating at once. Really though, with what we've seen from the reading comprehension of JoJo fans, it isn't surprising that people would get confused. Personally, I enjoy most of what happens in this arc. The fight between Jolene and Westwood is actually one of my favorite fights in the part, just from how brutal it is. Dragon's Dream seems to be one of the most hated fights, but I never saw much wrong with it. People seem to have some kind of aversion to the feng shui concept, and based on what people say about it, I think they might just be skipping Anasui's explanation of it altogether. Yo-Yo Ma is another often hated one, but again, I actually like this fight since I find the enemy really funny, and I like the idea of a stand that just pretends to be your friend. Our next hot take says that Part 6 is the worst written part, with Pucci being one of the worst written villains. Now, this guy just goes on in this comment, so to sum it up, he dislikes the contrivances that carry Pucci through the story and believes they are lazy writing. First, he seems angry that Pucci coincidentally met the three sons of Dio, who are coincidentally bound by fate since Araki wanted it that way. Now, this criticism is just very strange, since they seem to both simultaneously accept the premise that fate exists within the story, but then they're angry at supposed coincidences taking place. In reality, the force that drew Dio's sons to Pucci is nothing new and had already been established by the manga over a decade prior. As we know from Part 3, certain families in JoJo, such as the Joestars, are connected by psychic links that in some circumstances allow them to sense each other's presence. In Part 4, this idea was expanded to show that other connections like these exist, such as the force that draws stand users together. Of course, Part 6 is very focused on this idea, with Dio studying the reasons that people are fated to meet and the gravity that draws them together, so it's no wonder that this force plays a big role in the story. With Pucci having absorbed the green baby and essentially becoming a Joestar, he now had a link to other people with the Joestar birthmark. Also remember that Pucci's stand had begun its transformation from White Snake to Sea Moon, and it's around this time that he starts to be surrounded by strange phenomena. As Part 6 tells us, the forces of time and gravity are intertwined, and with Pucci unlocking his gravity powers, we see time affected around him. Gravity is also directly mentioned as the force that controls fate in this world, which is very important to Pucci's plan. As Pucci got closer to Cape Canaveral, the anomalies got stronger and the power of gravity drew him and Dio's sons together. Immediately after meeting Ngalo, Pucci directly acknowledges this force, so I don't really see how that's not made clear. Pucci was becoming a focal point of gravity, which is why fate was aligning in such a specific way. One last thing about this comment, I just want to point out this part where he says that the suns were bound by fate because Araki wanted it that way. Like, yes, that is how fiction works, the author writes things the way they want it to be. Now we have a hot take related to the Part 6 ending. Here their main gripe seems to be that the ending invalidates the entire story of Part 6. They even say that you could skip Part 6 entirely since only the last chapter of it actually matters. This is really just a ridiculous criticism. The idea that because the events of Part 6 were undone in the ending, that it isn't actually necessary to watch it just doesn't make any sense. The fact that those events were overwritten was only possible because of those events themselves. And Part 6 is the result of years of build-up of JoJo's story and themes up to that point. The idea that you could just look at the last chapter, which mind you isn't actually in the final reset continuity until the last few pages, and get anything from that story is just ridiculous. And it's just as ridiculous as the idea that because what happened prior was overwritten, that it isn't still extremely important to the overall JoJo story. This next one isn't related to just one part, but applies to the whole series. Here they say that they have a problem with many of the JoBros of the series, since many of them aren't even close friends with the main character at all. Now obviously I can't really disagree with this idea since it's just their opinion of certain characters, but I do want to question the whole idea of JoBros to begin with. The comment seems to be working from the premise that there is meant to be an established best friend of each character and that certain characters are flawed for not fitting within that role. But there is simply no such thing as a JoBro. That's a fan term purely created to fit already existing characters into. And I really just don't get the purpose of doing such a thing if it's going to affect your enjoyment of the secondary characters. I also remember when we had the JoJo World event recently, which gave new merch and art of the main characters who each had a secondary character with them. And a lot of people seemed to make a fuss that it was using Kakyoin instead of Polnareff or Rohan instead of Okuyasu, as if the idea of who the JoBro is in each part is some established thing. Now obviously it's fine to categorize characters however you want, but I just don't understand causing yourself a bunch of grief where it isn't really necessary. For Part 7, we have a take related to the character of Sandman. They say that the way Sandman was handled in the Silent Way arc was underwhelming since he was reduced to just another mercenary working for Valentine. They also say that this ending for him goes against the themes of the part. Now, the heel turn of Sandman is definitely one of the most controversial plot points of Part 7, but I actually disagree here and I think the direction for his character makes sense. One of the main themes of Part 7 is individualism, with a character like Johnny or even the race in general representing an individual spirit, and someone like Valentine representing the collective of the US government and ideas like patriotism. Sandman is someone who started as an individual character when he entered the race to earn back his people's land. He's an individual here figuratively and literally, with him being the only racer running on foot. And Sandman did have a legitimate shot of winning the race, and in my recent video going over the racers, I actually broke down everyone's points with Sandman being one of the most likely to win. So the decision from Sandman to join Valentine is meant to be viewed as a tragic moment, with Sandman going against those ideals to take an easier way out. Sandman recognized the changing of the times and decided to go along with the system that Valentine had control over, and this is exactly what leads to his defeat. Sandman dies without regrets, since in the end he was always trying to help his people. The fact that he got drawn into Valentine's sphere of influence only strengthens that aspect of the story, showing how the overwhelming power and exploitation from the government corrupts the individual spirit into being another cog in its machine, even if that person still believes that what they're doing is right. For our next hot take, we move on to Diego. This person says that Diego is much more interesting than any versions of Dio from the original universe. They say that despite people claiming that Dio is a deep character, his depth didn't actually show up until Part 6, after he was already gone from the story. If you're familiar with me, you probably already know this, but I completely disagree with this take. Dio is not only one of my favorite JoJo characters, I also believe he is the single most important character in the series when it comes to reflecting JoJo's themes. And I would argue that Dio was not just fleshed out before Part 6, but that he was a very well-defined character even back to his early appearances. I actually already brought up some of the points about Dio earlier when I was talking about Giorno. But my main point here is that Dio is the main way that the JoJo series conveys its overall theme, which Araki says is to be a celebration of humanity. Dio, of course, tragically rejected his humanity, making him the natural villain of the series. And contrary to what this person claims, Dio's philosophical nature that we saw in Part 6 has always been a part of his character. Back in Part 1, Dio spoke about fate and how he and Jonathan's lives were intertwined, leading to him gaining an odd respect for Jonathan. And in Part 3, rather than just being a raving lunatic like people seem to remember him, he actually had many calmer moments where he spoke about the connections between people and his wish to overcome the Joestars. Most notably, he spoke about the concept of peace of mind, or the idea that if people served under him, they could become content in their situation by not having an uncertain future. And this lines up perfectly with the idea of heaven that we saw him and Pucci talk about in their flashbacks. As for whether Dio is better than Diego, I personally prefer Dio, but I do love Diego as a character. But you have to remember that Diego exists within the context of Dio's previous development. And it's because Dio is such a great character that Diego is able to work as another interpretation of him. This next one deals with a moment near the end of the story. They say Johnny's dad showing up at the end wasn't necessary, and that he was a better character just being a bad dad. I also disagree here. I think this moment where George owns up to his past behavior and tries reaching out to Johnny is a very touching one. People have argued a lot over whether George was redeemed in some way. Obviously that's up to interpretation, and I can't blame anyone for not forgiving George's past actions. But I think the portrayal of the grief of losing Nicholas making him say something so horrible is realistic, and it's a really powerful scene that strengthens Johnny's character. I think the fact that George brought Nicholas's boots here is also a really beautiful detail, since only he and Johnny could understand the significance of that, which makes me think of this moment as really genuine. And I think overall it was pretty tasteful, since we don't get any direct interaction between them and their future lives together are kept a mystery. So since I love it so much, I really just can't picture the manga or these characters without the scene. For the last hot take of the video, we have one related to the ending of Part 7. They say that the final line saying Marco would later die of a cold was actually an amazing conclusion to Gyro's character, since it forces you to question and rethink the entire journey up to that point. Now, I've always been interested by this moment, and for a long time never quite knew what to make of it. Pretty much everyone in the JoJo community could tell you that a ton of people are put off by this moment and believe it invalidates Gyro's actions in the story and his goal of saving Marco by just having him die. However, I don't think it's entirely that simple. For one, we don't actually know when Marco died. It doesn't say it was immediately after being released or anything, and he may have even been an adult when this happened for all we know. The main thing I think people are missing is that despite what fate Marco eventually had, this does not conflict with Gyro's past efforts. Gyro saw what was happening to Marco as immoral, and his journey started because he wanted to stop him from being unjustly killed. And that goal was accomplished with Marco receiving an amnesty following the revolution in the Kingdom of Naples. I think Gyro's decision to help Marco is actually a very interesting one when we think about him as a character. Gyro is a very superstitious person, something informed by a lot of his past experience. While performing an operation with his father Gregorio, they were forced to choose between saving a mother or a child. Gyro asked if they could save both, with Gregorio saying that if they made an attempt, a miracle could occur but it would endanger both patients. He then said that they should ask the husband who to save. Gregorio brings up an analogy where during the sport of tennis there are times that the ball hits the net and it becomes uncertain what side of the net it will land on. That decision is left up to fate and it's impossible for one person to choose what will happen. Gregorio is saying that the natural course of events should not be interfered with. Their obligation is to save one of the patients, and choosing to risk it and save both would be them overstepping their boundaries. Fundamentally, Gregorio believes that people have set roles that they must carry out, whether it be as a surgeon or an executioner. The Zeppeli family's place is filling that role in society. However, he says that they also believe in miracles and can pray for a better outcome without interfering. I mentioned the individualist themes of Part 7 earlier, and Gyro fits into this as well. He believes that you have to take action and risk disturbing the status quo to create the future you want to see. What's interesting is that whether Gyro or Gregorio is right is often up to interpretation. In the example of Wekapipo's sister, Gyro overstepped his boundaries to try and heal her eyesight. However, due to an unforeseeable interference, the rotation of his steel ball wasn't perfect and he instead blinded her forever. However, this actually turned out to be a good thing. If she was able to see again, she would have been seen as a threat by her family and killed. So the fact that Gyro's surgery was a failure was actually a miracle, protecting the girl's life. Gyro went against this philosophy again with his decision to gain an amnesty for Marco rather than to go along with the Zeppeli family's duty of execution. We see another example of this in Gyro's final battle with Valentine. Gyro went against his superstition of letting a woman ride with him which he believed would make the goddess of victory abandon him. Gyro decided to bring Lucy on his horse to save her and to use Love Train's Fisher to locate Valentine. But this decision ended up leading to his death when the Fisher interfered with the rotation of his steel ball. This whole scenario is meant to be another time where the ball hits the net and things are left up to fate, this time with fate siding with Valentine. So when we reach the end of the part, Marco's death is like the final thing that hammers in that idea. There really are times when things are completely out of your control. Gyro believed that he could personally interfere and save Marco, and the fact that he did this ultimately led to his own death. Whether Marco was freed was actually entirely out of Gyro's control, and it ended up happening due to a revolt that was completely unrelated to the story's events. And what's more, Marco's death by disease leaves him even more in the hands of fate. From Gregorio's perspective, simply fulfilling your duty and praying for a good outcome can make a miracle occur, like with Marco's release. But from Gyro's perspective, a miracle has to be earned. The thing I really like about these two ideas is that both are true. Gregorio was right that the decision was not Gyro's to make, but the fact that Gyro tried to influence that decision caused him to meet Johnny by chance, something that could also be seen as a miracle that created a better future. And that's every hot take we have for now. I got to cover some really big topics this time around, and some of these are even deserving of their own full videos down the line. If you have a JoJo hot take that you would like to see me respond to in the next video, go ahead and comment it down below. To keep up with any of my future videos, make sure to subscribe and click the notification bell. You can also join the Hum and Beat Discord to get updates on new videos and any JoJo news. Finally, I'd also appreciate it if you help support the channel on Patreon or by becoming a YouTube member. Both give the same benefits by having you featured at the end of the video and letting you submit viewer questions. This video's question comes from Arios. They ask, what is my favorite villain takes over the opening moment in JoJo? Well, I have 4 different ones to choose from here, but for me, the choice is actually very obvious. While I like all of them, there was simply nothing that could have prepared me for when I saw the world stop time in the opening for the first time. I was watching Part 3 weekly as it aired, and finally reaching the battle with Dio and seeing that happen was something that could not ever be replicated. After that point, everyone knew it was going to happen with the final opening, so obviously the surprise factor was mostly gone. But I also think the Part 3 one is the best executed version of this regardless. And I do think it works better with the 3D openings than it does with the 2D ones. If you want to submit a question, you can become a patron or member at any tier. For patrons, you can leave the question in the community chat, and members can leave it as a reply to the members-only community post. I try to answer 1 question per video, so feel free to leave as many of them as you want. Thank you for watching. This is the part of the video where I thank my $5 and up patrons and members. Thank you to Sloth Dog, Doorbell, Crayon, Rigo Vids, Zucato, Pumpkin Doge, Marrow, Almighty Quarth, Gatling Grove, Sponge Cake, Cakext, Feliciano Rabaja, Rayana Meme, Christian McDonough, Emmanuel Etienne, Pulse Dog, Zach Greenfield, FIFO, Rob Goliath, Jacob Smith, Big T, C Manga, Minty, Gold, Red Hot Mayonnaise, Jolene, Monticelli, Zenkai, Royal Slush, Chongo, Keenan, Perry, Noland, Miguel Antonio, John Braun, Cho Henshin, and Saint Bobo.